All right, we're in Acts chapter 17 in the life of Paul. He is in Athens. And we are about to begin going through his sermon, or his speech, however you want to look at it, to the Stoics and the Epicureans. We're going to look at that. But there's a couple of things we want to do before that. And this is what happens when you just continue to study. You find things that you didn't realize. We talked about that Paul escaped Berea, and he did escape without Timothy or Silas. He is escorted by someone. We don't know who they are. They were trustworthy. They could have been brethren. They could have been just trustworthy people. We don't know who they were, but they escort him not only to the coast, but on the ship and all the way to Athens, which is a good 250 miles by way of sea. And at the beginning of Acts chapter 17, not at the beginning of Acts chapter 17, at verse 16, now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Now, it's not until chapter 18, verse 5, that we get any word concerning Silas and Timothy. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit to testify to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Now, he's in Corinth at that point. They don't meet up until Corinth. But there's something written in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 that indicates something did happen in Athens that Acts doesn't inform us of. That evidently Timothy at least did make it to Athens, but was sent back to Thessalonica. That's what it looks like. Or Timothy went to Thessalonica and never went to Athens, and there's interpretations in either way. But let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Here is Paul writing to the brethren in Thessalonica. He says, therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone. Okay, something was happening in Thessalonica. At least they were getting word of it. And sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. Now we're going to continue this to verse 5. But it looks like Timothy at least went to Athens. And while at Athens there was news, or Timothy came with news concerning something happening in Thessalonica, and it was persecution happening in Thessalonica. And it looks like Paul sends him back to Thessalonica, which would be a week or so more traveling, taking ship back up the coast, back north up the coast, then to Berea, then on to Thessalonica. But notice what it says, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we were appointed to this. For in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation just as it happened, and you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. So, it looks like when he leaves Berea, of course they left Thessalonica and went to Berea, and then evil men came from Thessalonica and caused trouble in Berea, and Paul is the one that escaped, goes to Athens, but it looks like Timothy at least did make it to Athens, but is sent back to Thessalonica. That's what it looks like. If there's another way of looking at this, I don't know what it is. Because it sounds exactly like what occurred here in the book of Acts, going through chapter 17, with them going into Thessalonica, and then Berea, of course, and then him going to Athens and waiting for them. And evidently, Timothy did get there, but was not there for very long, evidently. Now, let's get to where we are in Acts chapter 17, and we're going to begin with all this, begin today, concerning his speech that he gives to the Athenians, but these aren't just a random group of Athenians, actually. He is invited to the Areopagus, that's Mars Hill, by the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. All right, now last week we briefly spoke on them, and that we talked about that Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, had to have lived during that time and would have known things during that time because he's way too accurate. Okay, so we have the Epicureans and the Stoic philosophers. They are in Athens. Is that historically accurate? Yes, it is. That's where it was founded. Those movements were founded in Athens and continued all the way to the 4th century. At least I think the Stoics did. Continued all the way to the 4th century. Or maybe even the 5th century. But let's begin with the Epicureans first. Okay, so like we stated last week, Epicureanism begins with Epicurus. He lives from 341 to 270 BC. So it's established in Athens. Though he's not born in Athens, he does end up in Athens, and he does have a school in Athens that he calls the Garden. And that is where Epicureanism is taught and developed. But it is based off of materialism. That's what Epicureanism is about. It's materialism. While Epicurus did believe there were gods, and he also believed that humans, people had souls, he thought that the gods had no interest whatsoever and were not involved whatsoever with events on the earth. They were far removed from that, and that when a person died, that was the end of their body and their soul. They did not exist anymore. Nothing, it was all gone. And so this is just materialism only, and that we are only affected by the things that are material, and that there's nothing supernatural that occurs. There is, like I said, there's no involvement by any divinity, by any god. There's no involvement at all. It's all stepped away. And that here is the basis of it all, is that pleasure is good. That's what it comes down to. The goal of Epicurus was pleasure, because that's all you got in this life. From a materialistic standpoint, that's all you got. There's going to be heartache. There's going to be all kinds of bad days. There's going to be things that come out of nowhere. And the purpose in all of this is just seeking pleasure while you can on this earth. All right, so now we go to the Stoics, and it begins with Zeno of Citium. And it's called Stoicism or Stoics for a reason. It was, to begin with, was called Zenoism, but his followers didn't like that. It wasn't catchy enough. No, they didn't want it based off of Zeno, actually, because there were some certain things that they thought he had flawed. He begins it, but there are certain things they thought it was flawed. Actually, Stoics or Stoicism is named from a particular porch. And in Greek, let me give you the Greek name, is Porkile Stoa, which is where they met. And this porch was part of a larger public area that there was a marketplace there. There was also a place where just public, for the public. Okay. And so that's where they met, is on that porch. And he taught. And they talked about, whatever Stoic philosophical things were to be taught today, and his basic philosophy. And this porch, or this, actually it's the agora, it's the porch at the agora, which is this large public area. The agora is just north. Yeah, it's on the north side of the Areopagus. So it's right next to the Areopagus, which is Mars Hill, which is where they invite him to talk. The Stoics and the Epicureans, they invite him to talk. So it's just right there. And with the Stoics, and beginning with Zeno, was the idea of seeking virtue. All right, that sounds great. Seeking virtue. And virtue was enough for happiness. That while things can occur that are really good in life, there are things that are going to occur that are going to be painful. And while it may be a miserable day today, or even a miserable year, that virtue was happiness enough. It was a matter of how you approached it rather than just being overwhelmed by it. And this was the approach to life. And actually Zeno was seen as he looked kind of like a haggard sort of just impoverished person, because that's the lifestyle he lived. He actually had some wealth to him, but he lived the word is ascetic, but ascetic, and that is a denial of basic comforts and things like that. And he just did not live in luxury at all, or even close to it. He was happy to look impoverished and deny himself different things. All right, so this is the schools of thought that continue on after these founders have been dead for a couple of centuries or so. So you have the Stoics and the Epicureans. Stoics, is seeking pleasure Stoics are that of virtue, looking for virtue, and the other was seeking pleasure. The Epicureans were seeking pleasure. Now, let's look at what he says. So we begin in verse 22. Acts 17, verse 22. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious." Now, we can go to other translations. The Old King James will say this. I'm reading from the New King James. Will say very superstitious. Okay. However it's going to be rendered, I see this as not a criticism, but as a beginning point of showing that, and he's putting them involved in this. He is including them in his speech, just like he would do with the Jews, So, and he's not the only one talking about our fathers. All right, there's a connection. Like Stephen, in talking to the synagogue of freedmen, he could speak of our father Abraham. He could speak of our fathers in the past. And there's a connection. He's involving his audience. Here, he is involving his audience actually in multiple ways. But he's first off talking about, this is what I have perceived, that you're very religious, which is actually, he's using it as a compliment because they believe in God, or they believe in gods. Anyway, they believe that there is something above creation. All right, so he says this, "For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription." So what Paul is actually telling them and telling us is that while he is waiting in Athens, verse 16, his spirit provoked within him when he saw the city was given over to idols. He's been wandering through the place. That's what he's been doing, because he finds this altar. Now, this isn't a temple. A temple would be easy to find. Temples are pretty large, or they can be anyway, like the Acropolis. The Acropolis, which is in Athens, that's a large, prominent building even to this day. But an altar is not. An altar is considerably smaller, and this was probably tucked away. I can't say this for sure, but probably tucked away somewhere in the city. And you'd have to be wandering around to be able to find this thing. And he just happens upon it, which is what he says. He says that I found an altar with this inscription, "To the unknown God." So he's been wandering through the city, and he has been seeing the objects of their worship, and he does see this, "To the unknown God." And what he's about to tell them is, and he's saying it, the one you want to worship, I'm going to present to you. So this isn't something they, as Athenians, would refuse necessarily, but this is what they've been wanting to do. And he's bringing it out. He's bringing it out, "To the unknown God." Let me tell you about that God. The God that you would worship, you worship without knowing. Okay? And you don't know anything about him. Let me tell you about him. And it puts them in it. Probably your local Athenians would know exactly what he's talking about. That they would know where this altar was. Presumably they would have. And so he says, "Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." So he's connecting it to them. He's connecting it that one, you're religious. Two, there is someone you want to worship. Now let me tell you how to worship him. Let me tell you how to worship him. And let's talk about him. So this isn't something entirely foreign to them. This is something that, okay, this is interesting. It connects them in with what he's saying. All right, now, the next part in this is he begins to form a logical argument. And we're going to look at this bit by bit. Verse 24. So he starts he's finished with his greetings of, "I've perceived this about you," and just basic observation, and that you are very religious, that you even have this altar. Now, let me tell you some logical things about God, because I'm about to tell you about the unknown God. I'm about to tell you something about it. And it's using logic. And the logic comes down to that if God created us, why do we think we need to create him? Okay. Why should we be thinking of him as gold or precious metal, silver or stone, when he created all those things and us on top of that? All right. And why would we think of God in a way of men's art and devising if we're his creation? All right, he's got to be above. This is going in the opposite direction. This is worshiping what we've created instead of worshiping our Creator. Okay, but this is what he says, verse 24. "God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." Now we're going to address all this. First off, he says, God made the world and everything in it. So he's going to get to the gold, the silver, the stone, and us, and people. He's going to get to that. But this is telling them where the world began. While they would agree the world was created by deity, they would have names, and there'd be different names, and there'd be a variety of different stories that went into it. And some of these things are so confusing. Is the earth with the Greeks and the Romans, what exactly was the earth? Are we living on the dead body of some ancient titan? I'd have to look into that again. But here is him telling, This is created by one God. Created, and it was designed by one God. That's who did it. And He is involved in all of it. Now, He's Lord of heaven and earth. Now, with the Greeks and the Romans just borrowed from the Greeks, and the Greeks actually borrowed a lot from other people as well. They just gave them Greek names, like the Romans gave them Latin names. Okay, that here is He is Lord of heaven and earth. Well, under the Greek beliefs, there is no Lord of heaven and earth. Everybody has like their own jurisdiction, their own region, like we can see is common with the Baals, that every village had their own Baal. And this is our Baal. You have your Baal, we have our Baal. Our Baal happens to be better than your Baal. Okay, that's just the way it is. Get used to it. Our Baal is just better. Or like with some of the enemies of Israel, their God is the God in the mountains. Okay, we're going to meet Him in the valley. With the Greeks, you had Poseidon, also known as Neptune, with the Romans getting a hold of it. He's got the sea. Zeus has the sky, and I'm not sure what else he might have. He might have land. I'm not sure what he has. But definitely the sky. And then you have all these others who have their own little jurisdiction or what they take care of. You have the god of war, who is Mars. You have the god of wine with Bacchus. You have just this whole variety, god of wisdom, god of romance or erotic love. You have the god of this and the god of that. And no one could be said to be Lord of heaven and earth. Because if Zeus claimed to be Lord of heaven, that is everything. Well, Poseidon would have a word with him, or somebody else would have a word with him of, no, you're not exactly. Not at all. But he's showing that we're talking about a creator who created everything, and He's Lord over everything. Now, we look at this. Does not dwell in temples made with hands. All right, now he's going to explain what that means, because we can think, well, at this point in time, there is a temple, and at this point in time when he's preaching this in Athens, in Jerusalem, there was a temple sitting right there. And prior to that, there was Solomon's temple that was sitting in the same spot. Now, the fact of the matter is that God did not ask, nor demand, nor suggest a temple. He never did. That was David's idea. Now, God allowed it to happen. David wasn't to build it. Solomon was to build it, and Solomon does. But he had, and God had nothing to do with the design of the temple. Not a single thing was involved with God telling them how to make that temple. Solomon did what he was going to do, and it was roughly designed after, it was like this tremendous embellishment off of the tabernacle, which God did design that. Every element in the tabernacle, everything from the materials to be used to how many poles to how many this, how many that, everything about the tabernacle, and of course all the furnishings that went into the tabernacle, all of that was designed by God. But that wasn't designed by hands, human hands. Nor was it to be a temple of where it's in one place. It was meant to be a place where there is the Ark of the Covenant is there, and also where the priests do their duty, where there's sacrifices to be made, and it was meant to be mobile. It could be anywhere, and there wasn't going to be just with the tabernacle, they didn't have to be a central location. It could be moved, and it was while they were traveling. Now, God allowed the temple to be made, and it's based off of the design, the basic principles of the tabernacle, in that there was a place for the sacrifices to be made with an altar that is by His design. Then there's also the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would be, and it's similar to, it's separated like it was in the tabernacle. Yes, ma'am.
What does it mean? Like, we know that God can't dwell in temples made by hand, but He put His name on it.
Mm-hmm.
Now His name to be made.
Yes. Now, with the temple like in Solomon's temple, or with the temple that was from Ezra and Nehemiah's day, Ezra's day, that temple, yes, he did have his name there. And his presence was there because the Ark of the Covenant was there. Okay, that's by His design. Ark of the Covenant is His. It was made by men in Moses' day, by experts in craftsmanship in Moses' day, but He's the one that designed it. He designed it. And if the Ark of the Covenant was not in the temple, He's not in the temple. Okay? And also, if there's idolatry in the temple, He's not in that temple. And we can see that from the book of Ezekiel, that once they start bringing in idolatry, which they did, and we see that in the book of Ezekiel, His presence leaves the temple. And we see in Jeremiah's day of don't think that just because you have the temple that you are safe from what's about to happen, because you're not safe. And God's going to dismantle that temple using the Babylonians to do it. It's going to be completely dismantled. Okay, now, does God want to be worshiped by men? Yes. But His point is as though He needed anything. That's His point. His point is, and we can go into this further. He doesn't say this, but His point is God created everything. But God's also eternal. There's from eternity, there hasn't been any people, no man, woman, or child, from eternity. Before He creates Adam and Eve on the sixth day, there was no person that would be called human, no one like us that existed. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need us. As though He's dependent on us. He doesn't. He's not dependent on anybody. Does He have servants? Yes. Angelic beings? Yeah, they're ministers. They are ministers. Ministering spirits. That's what they do. Ministering to whom? Do they minister to Him? Yes, they do. Do they also minister to us? Yes, they do. Are we to be servants as well? Yes. Does He need us? No. I mean, if He needed me, He waited an awful long time for me to get here. Okay. It's like, what took you so long? I don't know. But He waited an awful long time. And the same thing with them, even though they're 2,000 years before I'm even exist, He doesn't need the Athenians. And if there is a God that needs humans to take care of them, there is a problem here. There's a problem. And God He's not dependent on us. He does not ask us to do something that He can't do, or ask us to do something that we shouldn't even be doing. He doesn't ask us to do these things. But more to the point in all this is that He doesn't need anything. So we come to this. He doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, because He doesn't. Since He gives to all life, breath, and all things. He gave this to all of us, and that includes the Athenians. And He's going to join Himself of, yes, you are Athenians, yes, He is a Jew. He is a Jew, they are Athenians, but they all are from God. They're all from God. He's not making a separation here. They are all created in the image of God. Every single one of them there. And so He doesn't need these things. He gives life, He gives breath, and all things. So why does He need anyone to build Him a temple, or need anyone to carve His image to be in that temple? And that the image has to have these various things that are presented before it. He doesn't. He doesn't need any of those things. Those things are what the Athenians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Gentile world were doing, but that's not what He needed. Now, verse 26. Now, what He's doing is He's showing God working inside humanity. So, for the Stoics there, who, wait a minute, no, I'm getting mixed up. No, for Epicurus and for the Epicureans, who think that, yes, this world was created by the gods and the gods take no interest in us whatsoever. This is now going to be pointing directly to their philosophy in this. That he says He made, because this shows His involvement in this. Aside from the fact that He gives life, breath, and all things, all right, He's showing God's involvement. And He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwelling. Okay, God has been involved in this. He's been involved in this. Yes, the borders of countries are there by God. They are there by God. And we can go all the way to Babel to show that's the way He wanted it. We can go all the way to Babel, of where they were just determined, at least those in the designing and wanting Babel to be magnificent, to keep everybody there. All right, God didn't want that. He said He wants them to spread out. Spread out. You've got a big world. You just go and there's plenty of room. You spread out, which is what He wanted them to do, wanted us to do. Just move away from all this, because it's when you have all the world population just centered in one place, when it goes bad, it's all bad. And so spread everybody out. So He says, though, to determine, and has determined their pre-appointed times. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. So because I've missed this first part. He's made from one blood every nation of men. And, okay, so that's Adam and Eve. From Adam and Eve are every nation of men. Through time, we get to every nation of men. Now, once we get to the flood, it narrows back down. It would have gotten very, very wide prior to the flood, and then it goes back down to really 8 people. 8 people, and it's, of course, Noah and his wife are not going to have any more children, but Shem, Ham, and Japheth will have children, and those children will be part of Babel and then spreading out. And we see that in Genesis 10 and also 11. But everybody, and He's bringing them in once again. Yes, Paul is a Jew. Yes, they are Athenians, but from one blood, every nation of men. All right, that would mean the Greeks, that would mean those Athenians, that would mean the Jews, that would mean those who are in just the hinterlands of their imagination, of people that live in the wild somewhere off, who knows where, off of some nameless sea or in some nameless mountain range. It would be everybody. Everybody. And so he made from one blood every nation of men on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So say, okay, so let's talk about the pre-appointed times, because we can show that. In Genesis chapter 12, the very beginning of that, we see where there is a nation that is being spoken of, promised to Abraham by God. And God knew where that nation was going to end up. That it was going to be in Egypt for a while, and then going to be in Canaan. Is that a pre-appointed time? Yes, it is. He knew in time, and he knew exactly how it was going to go. He knew exactly when it was going to happen. But that's a pre-appointed time and a pre-appointed boundary for that matter. And while the boundaries could change, that nation is going to be there. And it is pre-appointed because he's speaking about it in Genesis, and it wouldn't come to it to really happen until we get to the book of Joshua, where the land promise is fulfilled, and you have a people now in their a land they can now call home. Pre-appointed, yes, but that's not the only one pre-appointed. That's not the only one at all. We have a promise giving to Ishmael concerning Ishmael. Genesis 21:13, I will also make a nation of the son. Verse 18, I will make him a great nation. He's going to become a great nation. So is that pre-appointed? Yes, it is. Yeah, that is pre-appointed. And so just from Isaac and Ishmael, we can see pre-appointed peoples or pre-appointed nations. That God saw what was going to happen. And that there was a time when these would be nations, not just a few descendants, but these are now nations. And this would hold true to every people that has ever lived on this earth. That he knew there was a pre-appointed time for these, going back to Genesis chapter 10 with what's commonly referred to as the Table of Nations, that you have someone like Tarshish, who his descendants are going to end up in Spain. Tarshish is the ancient name of Spain. You also have other ancient names, Jubal, not Jubal, but let me hop over there real quick so I can give you the names for sure. Javan, rather. Javan, ancient name, the very ancient name of the Greeks. Knowing full well that's from him there are going to be the Greeks. This would be pre-appointed. But you also have names involved in this or are brought into this that they're all over the place. Of course, you have that of Nimrod, and he's going to bring about Assyria. That is going to come into being. You also have Cush, which is the ancient name of Ethiopia. All right, that's a people. That's a pre-appointed people. That God very well knew that these descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth would become nations. He knew it. And it goes back to Genesis chapter 10 in speaking about this, which actually the spreading out doesn't. Genesis chapter 10 is not just in strict chronological order. It's showing where everyone spread out from the genealogy. And then we go to 10 and there in only a few verses, about 9 verses, we have Babel and how it was done, what occurred. And everyone leaving Babel. But here are those pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwelling. He's the one that set the national boundaries, if you will, or even when they weren't necessarily what we might call a nation with a centralized government and all that, there were definite boundaries. There is a reason why at the area where England and Scotland meet, there is what's known as the Hadrian's Wall. There's also another wall up in that area. Now, the people north of that line, they could be called a loose group of tribes. All right, they really were not one united people with the king over them. They did not have that. They were just a bunch of loose tribes and probably were at war with each other until they have a common enemy, the Romans, and then they stop the Romans flat right there. Romans do not go much beyond that line. They hold that line or try to hold that line. And but that's showing a clear demarcation of where, from this point on, you're not in Rome anymore. Or you're not under the Roman Empire anymore. And while Rome did have that southern part of England, all right, that it's all part of an empire. And they were over what came to be known as the Romano-Celts. They were Celts that lived in that southern region, and they really became Romanized because the Romans are there. And they see how the Romans work, and Romans are bringing wealth, and the Romans are making roads, and the Romans are doing all these other things. And they actually liked, for the most part, the Romans. I'm sure not everything about them was likable, but they brought a lot of good to it. Nonetheless, it's part of an empire. Now, so there are boundaries of their dwellings. And the point I want to make concerning what is modern-day Scotland is that even when there was not some powerful king or a centralized government, there were still clear boundaries. They are still clear. You cross this river, whatever the river happens to be, you cross this river, you're now in the area of the, and fill in the blank. Okay, so you be careful crossing that river. You be careful on the other side, because I don't know what they're like. They might be okay with strangers. They might not be okay with strangers. But that is the boundary right there. Now, we come to verse 27. Verse 27. So, and here is showing a design in this. There is a design so that they should seek the Lord, and that in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him. So this goes to the ancient past. He's saying they. He's not saying us. He's saying they. This is going to the ancient past and all the way up to the current day. That this was done in the hopes, by way of design, that they would grope for God. They would search for God in the hopes that they might find Him. And then he says, though He is not far from each one of us. And He's putting Himself in with the Athenians. Once again, it's not the Athenians and the Jews, it's everybody. It's everybody. He is not far from each one of us. And this I can only take as the truth, that if there was someone living in just some far off island, some far off continent, that if that person sought after God, that they would have found Him. That's what he's saying, and I can't doubt it. I can't doubt it at all. How was that done exactly? I don't know, but I'm being told that's what would have happened if they looked for Him. If they looked for Him. And because he's saying that's what was hoped for. That's what was hoped for, and that He's not far from each one of us. That would include those that are in the far-flung reaches of the world, whether you're up toward the poles or down toward the South Pole. If you happen to be in the swamps, in the deserts, in the canyons, in the mountains, in the plains, wherever you happen to be, wherever you find yourself, and the people that you are from, He's not far from any one of them. Never was far from any one of them. Never was. Now, he continues on in the effect that with all this. And we're just going to read this next week. Next week we're going to speak, because we got to close it. Next week we're going to speak more concerning verse 28, because there's a lot to be said for verse 28. For in Him we live and move and have our being, as also one of your own poets have said, for we are also His offspring. Now this shows Paul is familiar with Greek poetry, because this is Aratus of Soli, or Soli. He had to have been familiar with it, and he thought that they would be too, and probably they were. They probably knew exactly who he was talking about and what poem he was talking about. But once again, he has been using the us. He has been using we. For in Him we live and move our being. This is everybody. And now he brings in even one of your own poets agrees with this. So this isn't so foreign. This isn't so foreign. God is always, this God who you did not know has always been with you. You just didn't know it. You just didn't know it. And that even some of your poets have said precisely what I'm saying right now. So this isn't so foreign. This isn't so weird. This isn't such a babbler as it turns out. He's agreeing with this Paul. This Jewish man is agreeing. I can just see the reasoning and all this. This Jewish man, Paul, is reasoning with one of our poets. You know, I didn't expect this at all. Now, as I said, next week we will continue in this, and we're going to be looking at what he just said, because there's something very fascinating about it. And hopefully next week we can continue. And I appreciate everybody being with us, and we will call it a class.